What if Daenerys Targaryen had actually won Game of Thrones? Would Westeros have been a utopia under her rule, or a tyrannical nightmare? Join us as we explore the shocking and unpredictable consequences of Daenerys' victory in this thought-provoking analysis. Forget everything you thought you knew about Game of Thrones ending. We're diving into a parallel universe where Daenerys conquers the Seven Kingdoms and faces the consequences of her iron fist. Get ready for shocking twists, surprising alliances, and a new vision of Westeros you won't believe. Was Daenerys Targaryen a liberator or a tyrant? Explore the dark side of her ambition and discover the chilling reality of what might have happened if she had won Game of Thrones. This is a story of power, betrayal, and the impossible choices we make in the face of destiny. In the world we know, Daenerys Targaryen's quest for the Iron Throne ended in madness and death, her dreams of liberation consumed by fire and blood. But what if the Mother of Dragons had chosen differently? What if, in that crucial moment above King's Landing, she had stayed her hand and claimed victory through mercy rather than massacre? The bells of surrender ring across the capital. Daenerys sits atop Drogon, circling the Red Keep as Lannister banners fall and Targaryen flags are raised. Below, her armies Dothraki, unsullied, and northern forces stand victorious but disciplined. The city remains intact, its people alive to witness the dawn of a new era, standing before the Iron Throne, but refusing to sit upon it. Daenerys addresses the gathered lords and survivors of the final battle. Tyrion Lannister, bloodied but alive, reports that Cersei died in the partial collapse of the Red Keep during Drogon's targeted strikes on military position. The war is over, but Daenerys surprises everyone with her next declaration. "I will not rule from this throne," she announces to the stunned assembly. "It represents everything I sought to destroy, the elevation of one family above all others through fear and sword. Instead, we will build something new." Jon Snow, standing among the Northern Lords, watches in amazement as the woman he loves begins to fulfill her truest promise, not just to break the wheel, but to replace it with something unprecedented in Westerosi history. Within weeks of her victory, Daenerys calls for a great council unlike any before it. In the rebuilt Dragon Pit, representatives from across Westeros gather, not just lords, but common folk, guild leaders, former slaves, and scholars. The proposal she presents shocks the assembled crowd. The establishment of the Dragon Council, a governing body consisting of elected representatives from each kingdom, with the monarch serving as a guardian of the realm rather than its absolute ruler. Each kingdom will select 3 representatives, 1 noble, 1 from the merchant class or guilds, and 1 from the common folk. These 21 members, along with advisors and Daenerys herself, will form the Dragon Council. Major decisions will require majority vote, stripping away the absolute power that has corrupted so many rulers before her. The reaction is mixed but telling. Lord Royce of the Vale expresses skepticism about abandoning thousands of years of noble rule, while Gendry, now legitimized as a Baratheon, speaks passionately about his experiences in Flea Bottom and the suffering of the small folk during the noble games of throne. Even Sansa Stark, initially wary of Daenerys, begins to see the wisdom in this revolutionary approach. When Yara Greyjoy questions what happens if kingdoms refuse to participate, Daenerys surprises everyone again. "Then you remain independent," she states firmly. "I will not force unity through conquest, but I believe you'll find that cooperation serves us all better than isolation." This declaration cements something crucial. Daenerys has truly learned from her mistakes in Essos, understanding that lasting change must come from within, not be imposed from without. The months following Daenerys' victory witness unprecedented cooperation across Westeros. King's Landing transforms from a war-torn capital into a symbol of renewal. Drogon, rather than being an instrument of terror, becomes a tool of reconstruction, helping clear rubble that would take hundreds of men weeks to move. Former slaves work alongside Westerosi craftsmen, sharing advanced techniques learned in the great cities of Essos. The religious landscape changes dramatically as well. While the Sept of Baelor is rebuilt to honor the faith of the Seven, temples to other faiths rise alongside it, shrines to the Lord of Light, the drowned god, and the old gods. This religious tolerance, unprecedented in Westerosi history, signals a fundamental shift in how the realm approaches diversity and inclusion. Tyrion, serving as Hand of the Queen, oversees much of this transformation. His pragmatic approach proves invaluable in navigating the complexities of integrating two vastly different cultures. The traditional small council expands to include voices previously excluded from power. A former unsullied officer serves as Master of War, bringing military discipline and tactical knowledge from Essos, while representatives from various guilds advise on economic matters. The treasury, surprisingly, proves more robust than expected. Cersei's paranoid hoarding of gold throughout the Red Keep provides substantial funds for reconstruction, while new trade agreements with Essos, facilitated by Daenerys' reputation there, bring unprecedented prosperity to Westeros. As the Dragon Council system takes shape across the Seven Kingdoms, each region adapts the model to their unique circumstances. The North, under Sansa's guidance, embraces the system enthusiastically, with their representative including a Stark loyalist lord, a White Harbor merchant, and a farmer from the Gift, whose family suffered during the War of the Five Kings. The Reach, fertile and prosperous, selects representatives who focus on agricultural innovation and trade. Their common folk representative, a farmer's daughter from the southern vineyards, brings practical knowledge about crop rotation and soil management that proves invaluable in the post-war recovery. The Westerlands prove more challenging, with old Lannister loyalists initially resistant to change. However, the promise of renewed trade and the practical benefits of the system gradually win over even skeptical nobles. Davin Lannister, elected as their noble representative, works to rebuild the region's reputation, while a goldsmith from Lannisport brings crucial economic expertise to the council. Doran embraces the new system with characteristic independence, seeing it as a way to maintain their autonomy while benefiting from increased cooperation with the rest of Westeros. Their representatives include Prince Martell's cousin, a Dornish wine merchant, and a former Water Garden servant, whose insights into palace logistics prove surprisingly valuable. The Iron Islands present the most interesting case. Initially skeptical, Yara Greyjoy gradually sees the benefits of cooperation over isolation. Their representatives, a Greyjoy cousin, a shipbuilder from Pike, and a reformed Reaver, who speaks to the possibilities of legitimate trade, help transform the island's reputation from pirates to skilled sailors and shipwrights. Not everyone embraces the new order. Remnants of the old nobility, particularly those who lost power and influence under the Dragon Council system, plot and scheme. Several minor uprisings occur in the first year, led by dispossessed lords who see the new system as an existential threat to their way of life. The Faith Militant, though officially disbanded, finds new purpose in opposing the religious tolerance promoted by Daenerys' government. Underground movements emerge, preaching that the old gods and foreign faiths threaten the Seven's dominion over Westeros. These tensions occasionally erupt into violence, requiring careful handling to avoid religious warfare. Economic challenges also persist. While the new trade agreements bring prosperity to major cities and ports, rural areas struggle to adapt to changing markets and new agricultural techniques. The integration of former slaves into Westerosi society, while generally successful, creates friction in some regions where traditional hierarchies run deep. Perhaps most significantly, the question of succession looms large. Daenerys, having given up absolute power, must now consider how the Dragon Council system will survive her death. The precedent of elective monarchy versus hereditary rule creates ongoing debate within the council chambers. Daenerys' victory in Westeros sends shockwaves across the narrow sea. In Essos, The surviving great masters and slave cities watch nervously as reports filter back of the Dragon Queen's success in implementing her revolutionary ideals. Some cities experience their own uprisings, inspired by news from Westeros. The free cities find themselves in a complex position, while some, like Braavos with its own tradition of elected leadership, welcome increased trade and cooperation with the new Westeros. Others worry about the spread of democratic ideals. Pentos, in particular, struggles with internal tensions as its magister system faces growing challenges from merchant classes inspired by Westerosi development. Daenerys uses her dragons strategically in international relations, not as weapons of conquest, but as symbols of power that discourage aggression while facilitating diplomacy. Drogon's presence at trade negotiations ensures favorable terms, while his ability to rapidly transport envoys revolutionizes diplomatic communications across both continents. The Dothraki integration proves crucial to these international relationships. Rather than being seen as foreign invaders, the Horse Lords become valuable intermediaries in trade negotiations and cultural exchange. Their mobility and knowledge of Essos geography make them natural ambassadors and merchants. As the first year of the Dragon Council concludes, the transformation of Westeros becomes undeniable. Trade flourishes as never before, with new roads and improved harbors facilitating commerce between kingdoms that once viewed each other with suspicion. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency, long overdue reforms, streamlines economic activity across the realm. Education receives unprecedented attention. Samwell Tarly, as Grand Maester, establishes new schools in each kingdom, teaching not just noble children, but any who wish to learn. The integration of Essosi knowledge with Westerosi traditions creates innovations in everything from agriculture to architecture. The role of women in society evolves dramatically, with Daenerys as queen and powerful female representatives like Sansa Stark and Yara Greyjoy holding significant positions. Traditional gender roles begin to shift. The Dragon Council includes numerous women representatives from all social classes, their voices carrying equal weight in governance decisions. Military reforms transform the realm's defense capability. The integration of unsullied discipline with Westerosi tactical knowledge creates a professional army unlike anything previously seen in the Seven Kingdoms. More importantly, this force serves the realm rather than individual lords, reducing the likelihood of internal conflict. The alternate timeline significantly impacts the relationships between key characters. Jon Snow, freed from the burden of killing the woman he loves, finds new purpose in helping bridge the cultural gap between Northerners and Essosi immigrants. His unique position as both Stark and Targaryen makes him an invaluable mediator in council disputes. Tyrion Lannister flourishes in this environment, his intelligence finally applied to constructive rather than merely survival purposes. His experience in Essos and understanding of both cultures proves crucial in implementing reforms. The guilt that would have consumed him in the original timeline is replaced by genuine satisfaction in meaningful work. Sansa Stark emerges as perhaps the most transformed character. Initially skeptical of Daenerys, she becomes one of the Dragon Council's most effective advocates, using her political acumen to build coalitions and navigate complex negotiations. Her relationship with Daenerys evolves from suspicion to mutual respect, and eventually genuine friendship. Arya Stark finds purpose in serving as an unofficial ambassador to regions struggling with the transition. Her ability to move unseen and understand common folk makes her invaluable in identifying and addressing problems before they escalate into larger conflict. The relationship between Daenerys and Jon develops differently as well. Without the tragedy of fratricide casting its shadow, their love story becomes one of partnership in building a better world. Their eventual marriage unites the realms symbolically, while their children represent hope for a future where the old divisions no longer matter. The transition occurs during one of the harshest winters in recent memory, testing the new system's resilience. However, the cooperation fostered by the Dragon Council proves invaluable. Northern grain stores are shared with southern kingdoms, While Dornish preserved foods help communities survive the lean months, the improved trade networks ensure that no region faces starvation alone. Drogon's ability to rapidly transport supplies becomes crucial during winter emergencies. The dragon, once a symbol of conquest, becomes associated with rescue and relief. Stories spread of Drogon delivering food to snowed-in villages and clearing blocked mountain passes, fundamentally changing how the small folk view both dragons and their Targaryen queen. The reconstruction efforts continue even through winter, with indoor projects taking precedence. New techniques learned from Essos improve insulation and heating in northern castles, while southern architectural knowledge helps create more efficient structures throughout the realm. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome of Daenerys' peaceful victory is the cultural flowering that follows. The mixing of Essosi and Westerosi traditions creates new forms of art, music, and literature. Bards sing songs that blend northern ballads with Myrish harmonies, while artisans create works incorporating techniques from across both continents. The great libraries of Old Town expand dramatically as scholars from Essos share their knowledge with Westerosi Meisters. New discoveries in medicine, engineering, and natural philosophy emerge from this cultural exchange. The printing techniques learned in the Free Cities revolutionize the spread of knowledge throughout Westeros. Religious festivals become celebrations of diversity rather than sources of division. The Feast of the Seven incorporates elements from other faiths, while new holidays celebrating the harvest, the sea, and the changing seasons bring communities together across religious lines. As the first year of her reign concludes, Daenerys Targaryen has achieved something unprecedented in Westerosi history. She has fundamentally transformed the nature of power itself. Rather than simply replacing one ruler with another, she has created a system where power flows from the people upward rather than being imposed from above. The Iron Throne, melted down and reforged into a simple chair surrounded by the council seats, symbolizes this transformation. No longer does one person sit in judgment over millions. Instead, representatives of those millions share in the responsibility of governance. The dragons, once symbols of Targaryen dominance, become symbols of protection and renewal. Drogon's presence at council meetings serves as a reminder of power's responsibility rather than its privilege. The dragon's role in reconstruction and relief efforts transforms the creature from harbinger of doom to guardian of the realm. Most importantly, Daenerys has proven that the wheel can indeed be broken without destroying everything it once supported. The system she creates preserves the best of Westerosi traditions, while incorporating the innovations and perspectives that make governance truly representative. In this alternate timeline, Daenerys Targaryen's victory over King's Landing represents not an ending, but a true beginning. The Mother of Dragons becomes the mother of democracy. Her greatest conquest, not a city or kingdom, but the very concept of absolute power itself. The girl who once declared she would break the wheel has indeed shattered it, replacing it with something unprecedented in the known world. A government that serves all its people, not just the privileged few. The Seven Kingdoms, once fractured by endless wars and bitter rivalries, begin to heal under this new system. Trade flourishes, knowledge spreads, and for the first time in generations, the small folk have voices in their own governance. The Dragon Council becomes a model that other nations study, and in some cases adapt to their own circumstances. Daenerys' true victory lies not in claiming the Iron Throne, but in making it obsolete. Her legacy will not be measured in conquered cities or slain enemies, but in the millions of lives improved by her revolutionary approach to power. In choosing mercy over vengeance and cooperation over domination, she achieves what no Targaryen before her managed: a lasting peace, built on justice rather than fear. The dragons still soar over Westeros, but now they carry messages of hope rather than threats of destruction. In this world, winter may come and go, but the spring that follows Daenerys' victory promises to last for generations. The wheel is broken, and from its ruins rises something beautiful, inclusive, and enduring. A realm where power truly belongs to the people it serves. The Iron Throne may have been melted down and reformed, but the dragon blood that flows through Daenerys Targaryen's veins carries with it both the capacity for great mercy and terrible wrath. In the months following her victory over King's Landing, the true nature of her rule begins to emerge. A complex blend of revolutionary idealism and pragmatic authoritarianism that will define her reign and create the very conflicts that threaten to tear apart the new order she seeks to build. Daenerys approaches governance with the same passionate intensity that characterized her conquest of Slaver's Bay. Her daily routine begins before dawn, reviewing reports from across the Seven Kingdoms while Drogon rests in the courtyard of the Red Keep. The Queen's justice, as it comes to be known, operates on principles that seem contradictory to those accustomed to traditional Westerosi rule. Absolute fairness coupled with absolute intolerance for injustice. In the throne room, now transformed into a circular chamber where the Dragon Council meets, Daenerys demonstrates this duality daily. When a merchant from Lannisport brings evidence of his former lord cheating tenants out of their harvests, she listens with the patience of a loving mother, asking detailed questions about crop yields and rent agreements. Yet when the evidence proves overwhelming, her judgment comes swift and merciless. The guilty lord finds his lands redistributed to his former tenants, his titles stripped and himself sentenced to labor in the fields he once exploited. Justice delayed is justice denied becomes her most quoted phrase, echoing through the halls of power and the streets of King's Landing alike. This principle guides every decision, from matters of state to the smallest disputes between neighbors. Daenerys has created a system where any citizen, regardless of birth or station, can bring their grievances directly to the Dragon Council. The backlog of cases, centuries of accumulated injustices, stretches for months, but the Queen works through them with mechanical determination. Her advisors often watch in amazement and growing concern as she processes case after case, without apparent fatigue. Tyrion Lannister, serving as hand, finds himself in the unprecedented position of counseling restraint rather than action. Where previous monarchs might have delegated such mundane matters to lesser officials, Daenerys insists on personal involvement, believing that true justice requires the ruler to witness the suffering of the ruled. This hands-on approach extends to her treatment of the nobility. The Dragon Council may include elected representatives, but Daenerys makes it clear that participation is not optional for those with power. Lord after lord finds themselves summoned to explain their stewardship of lands and people. Some, like Lord Tarly of Horn Hill, embrace the new expectations and work diligent to improve conditions for their small folk. Others resist, viewing the Queen's oversight as an insult to ancient privileges. The Queen's daily schedule reflects her governing philosophy. After morning council sessions, she regularly tours different districts of King's Landing, often arriving unannounced at workshops, markets, and residential areas. These inspections, while popular among the common folk, create constant tension among administrators and merchants, who never know when the Queen might appear to examine their operations personally. Her treatment of former enemies reveals perhaps the most complex aspect of her governing style. Those who surrendered and demonstrate genuine commitment to the new order find her remarkably forgiving. Jaime Lannister, captured after Cersei's death, expected execution but instead finds himself assigned to training the new royal guard, his knowledge of military tactics valued over his past crime. However, those who continue to resist or undermine the new system face increasingly harsh consequences. The transformation of the Red Keep itself symbolizes Daenerys' approach to power. The private royal apartments have been reduced in size, with the extra space converted into offices for council representatives and meeting rooms for citizen petitions. The throne room's circular design ensures that no one sits above others during council sessions. Yet Daenerys' chair remains subtly elevated, a reminder that while power may be shared, ultimate authority still rests with the Dragon Queen. Her relationship with the faith of the Seven proves particularly complex. While promoting religious tolerance, Daenerys demonstrates little patience for what she sees as the faith's historical complicity in oppressing the poor. When the High Septon objects to the construction of temples for other religions, she responds with characteristic directness, Your gods will be honored alongside all others or not at all. The implicit threat behind these words, delivered while Drogon rests visibly in the courtyard, ensures compliance, but also breeds resentment among the more traditional faithful. Daenerys' unwavering commitment to justice, while admirable in theory, creates practical problems that threaten the stability of her reign. Her absolute standards, forged in the crucible of Essos, where slavery represented clear moral lines, proved difficult to apply to the complex feudal relationships that have governed Westeros for millennia. The first major crisis emerges from her handling of debt obligations. Throughout the Seven Kingdoms, small folk owe debts to lords, lords owe debts to merchants, and everyone owes debts to the Iron Bank of Braavos. Daenerys' attempt to address what she sees as exploitative lending practices creates a cascade of economic disruption. When she cancels debts owed by farmers who can prove their lords charged usurious rates, the decision seems just. However, these same lords had borrowed money from merchants to finance their estates, creating a chain of obligation that her intervention shattered. Tyrion finds himself spending increasingly long hours attempting to mediate between the Queen's moral imperatives and economic reality. "Your Grace," he explains during one heated council session, "if we cancel Lord Fossaway's debts to his tenants, he cannot pay the goldsmith who forged his farm tools, who cannot pay the iron merchant who supplied his materials, who cannot pay the miners who extracted the ore. Justice for one becomes injustice for many." Daenerys' response reveals the inflexibility that will increasingly characterize her reign. Then let them all find honest work that doesn't depend on the exploitation of others. This dismissal of complex economic relationships as simple moral failures demonstrates how her experiences as a liberator of slaves poorly prepared her for the nuanced governance of a feudal society. The treatment of former slavers from Essos living in Westeros creates another significant source of conflict. Daenerys had promised amnesty to those who surrendered and integrated into Westerosi society. But her definition of integration proves demanding. When Hizdahr zo Lorak, now a wine merchant in Old Town, is discovered to have quietly purchased several indentured servants, Daenerys views this as a return to slavery. His execution, carried out by Dragonfire in the market square, sends shockwaves through the SOC community in Westeros. The incident reveals a fundamental contradiction in Daenerys' justice system. While she claims to have created a government of laws rather than personal rule, her own moral code consistently overrides legal precedents when the two conflict. The Dragon Council, despite its democratic structure, finds itself repeatedly overruled when its decisions fail to align with the Queen's sense of justice. Religious conflicts intensify as Daenerys' tolerance proves selective. While she protects the rights of followers of R'hllor and the Old Gods, she shows increasing hostility toward religious practices she deems harmful. The faith's traditional opposition to bastards and their exclusion from inheritance rights provokes particular anger. When she mandates that all children, regardless of birth circumstances, have equal inheritance rights, the resulting family disputes create chaos throughout the kingdom. The case of House Frey becomes emblematic of these conflicts. With Walder Frey dead and his legitimate heirs scattered or killed during the wars, dozens of bastard Freys emerge to claim portions of the Twins and its lands. Daenerys' mandate seems just in principle, but its practical application requires determining the legitimacy of claims going back generations. The resulting legal battles consume resources and create lasting resentment among noble houses who see their own inheritance traditions threatened. Her handling of crime and punishment reveals another area where her desire for perfect justice creates imperfect results. Daenerys insists that punishments must fit not just the crime but the circumstances that led to it. A man who steals bread to feed his family receives assistance and job training, while a merchant who hoards grain during winter faces death by dragonfire. The dramatic disparity in punishments, while reflecting the Queen's moral reasoning, creates uncertainty throughout the legal system. Judges and magistrates struggle to predict what sentences will satisfy the Queen's standards. Some err on the side of leniency and find their decisions overturned with harsh criticism. Others impose severe punishments preemptively, only to face the Queen's wrath for showing insufficient mercy to the circumstances of the crime. This inconsistency undermines the rule of law that Daenerys claims to champion. The Queen's personal involvement in individual cases, while demonstrating her commitment to justice, creates procedural problems that grow more serious over time. When she personally investigates the case of a raped serving girl in the Riverlands, her presence transforms what should be a routine legal proceeding into a royal spectacle. The accused lord, guilty of the crime, nonetheless receives a trial that is neither fair nor impartial, with the Queen's dragons circling overhead as witnesses testify. These conflicts extend to international relations as well. The Iron Bank of Bravos, long accustomed to dealing with Westerosi monarchs, focused primarily on maintaining power, finds Daenerys' moral approach to governance deeply unsettling. When she refuses to honor debts incurred by previous rulers for what she considers immoral purposes, such as financing wars of conquest, the bank's representatives warn of economic consequences that could destabilize the entire realm. The seeds of rebellion against Daenerys' rule are sown not in the great castles of defiant lords, but in the accumulated grievances of those who find their traditional ways of life disrupted by her relentless pursuit of justice. Unlike the clear-cut conflicts of her conquest, the opposition to her reign emerges from unexpected quarters and takes forms that her military experience in Essos poorly prepared her to address. The first organized resistance comes from an unlikely source: the guild masters of King's Landing. These middle-class merchants and craftsmen initially welcomed Daenerys' victory, seeing opportunity in the promised expansion of trade with Essos. However, her labor reforms mandating shorter working hours, higher wages, and safer conditions cut deeply into profit margin. When she establishes worker tribunals with the power to fine employers for violations, the guild masters begin to organize in secret. Their rebellion takes the form of economic sabotage rather than open warfare. Shipments mysteriously arrive late or spoil. Guild masters report inflated costs for materials and labor, making royal projects appear wastefully expensive. Most dangerously, they begin spreading rumors among their workers that the Queen's foreign advisors are corrupting her judgment, turning her against the very people who built her throne room and forge her weapon. Bronn, now serving as Master of Coin, brings these concerns to the Dragon Council with characteristic bluntness. Your Grace, the Guild Masters aren't planning to march on the Red Keep with swords. They're planning to starve it with empty supply wagon. And they're convincing their workers that you care more about foreign slaves than Westerosi craftsmen. The religious underground presents a more traditional but equally dangerous form of resistance. The faith militant may have been officially disbanded, but many of its former members have simply gone underground, maintaining their weapons and their fervor while working ordinary jobs throughout the kingdom. They view Daenerys' religious tolerance as an assault on the Seven's rightful dominance over Westeros, and her empowerment of women as contrary to divine will. These religious rebels operate through a network of septons and septas who preach subtly subversive sermons. They don't openly call for rebellion, but their words plant seeds of doubt about the legitimacy of a foreign queen who consorts with fire priests and allows heathen temples in the shadow of the great sept of Baelor. When reports reach the Dragon Council of villages where attendance at services for other faiths has been met with anonymous threats and vandalism, the scope of the religious resistance becomes clear. The nobility's opposition proves more sophisticated and potentially more dangerous than either economic or religious resistance. Rather than openly defying the Dragon Council system, they work to subvert it from within. Lords who publicly embrace the new order privately coordinate to ensure their representatives vote as a bloc, effectively maintaining their traditional power while paying lip service to democratic reform. Lord Randall Tarly's brother, elected as the Reach's noble representative, appears to be a model council member, He speaks eloquently about serving the common good and supports popular measures like road improvements and granary construction. However, private correspondence intercepted by Varys' replacement spy network reveals his true purpose: to ensure that any truly revolutionary changes are delayed, modified, or quietly abandoned through procedural maneuvering. This noble resistance extends beyond the Dragon Council chamber. Throughout the kingdoms, lords begin implementing malicious compliance with royal edict. When ordered to improve conditions for their tenants, they do so by reducing the amount of land available for tenant farming, technically improving conditions for the remaining tenants, while forcing others into destitution. When mandated to allow common folk to participate in local governance, they create advisory councils with impressive titles, but no actual authority. The integration of Dothraki and unsullied warriors into Westerosi society creates another source of ongoing tension and potential rebellion. While both groups serve loyally, their presence in every major city and castle serves as a constant reminder of foreign conquest. Local populations already struggling with economic and social changes view these foreign soldiers with increasing resentment. In the Riverlands, still recovering from years of warfare, the sight of Dothraki horsemen patrolling roads and collecting taxes provokes particular anger. These are the same people who were taught from childhood to fear the horse lords as savage raiders from across the sea. Now they must accept them as agents of royal authority, a psychological adjustment that proves difficult for many to make. The situation becomes explosive when cultural misunderstandings lead to violence. Dothraki warriors, accustomed to taking what they need and viewing certain behaviors as acceptable, clash with Westerosi customs and laws. When a Dothraki patrol leader seizes horses he considers inferior in quality to what his men deserve, the resulting confrontation leaves several Westerosi dead and transforms local resentment into open hatred. Unsullied discipline creates different but equally serious problems. Their absolute obedience to orders, a strength in battle, becomes a weakness in peacekeeping. When ordered to enforce unpopular policies, such as collecting increased taxes from lords to fund infrastructure projects, they do so with mechanical efficiency that allows no room for explanation or accommodation. Their inability to bend rules or show discretion makes them appear as foreign oppressors rather than peacekeepers. The most dangerous opposition emerges from the remnants of House Lannister's network of supporters and debtors. Unlike the Starks who commanded loyalty through honor or the Baratheons who inspired fear through strength, the Lannisters built their power through careful cultivation of mutual obligation. Lords throughout Westeros owe their positions, their wealth, or their lives to Lannister patronage, creating a hidden network of opposition to the new regime. This network operates through seemingly innocent activities: old friends sharing drinks and reminiscing about better times, merchants quietly discussing how business was more profitable under the old system, septons praying for the souls of the faithful departed. Slowly, carefully, they build a picture of Daenerys' rule as foreign tyranny disguised as liberation, emphasizing every mistake, every harsh judgment, every cultural misstep made by her supporters. The network's most effective weapon proves to be Daenerys' own action. Every execution carried out by Dragonfire is described in gruesome detail and shared throughout the kingdom. Every economic disruption caused by her justice reforms is attributed to foreign influence corrupting traditional Westerosi value. Every appointment of an associate advisor is presented as evidence that the true power behind the throne lies across the narrow sea. Regional resistance takes on distinct characteristics reflecting local cultures and grievances. In the north, opposition centers around the fear that Southern politics will corrupt the straightforward honor that defines Northern identity. While Sansa Stark publicly supports the Dragon Council, private correspondence reveals significant resistance among lesser Northern lords who view the system as unnecessarily complex and foreign. The Iron Islands present perhaps the most complex case of regional opposition. While Yara Greyjoy has embraced cooperation with the new regime, Many Ironborn view the transition from reaving to legitimate trade as a betrayal of their fundamental identity. Underground movements begin promoting a return to the old way, viewing Daenerys's prohibition on raiding as an existential threat to Ironborn culture. Dorne's opposition takes the form of passive resistance rather than active rebellion. The Dornish embrace the Dragon Council system but implement it in ways that maintain their traditional independence. Their representatives regularly vote as a bloc on issues that might affect Dornish autonomy, effectively using the democratic system to preserve the very regionalism it was designed to transcend. The emergence of a pretender to the throne adds another dimension to the growing opposition, claiming to be a surviving son of Rhaegar Targaryen, a claim that is almost certainly false but impossible to disprove definitively. This young man gathers support from various opposition factions who see him as a rallying point for their grievance. Unlike Daenerys, he was born in Westeros, speaks without a foreign accent, and promises to restore traditional ways while maintaining popular reforms. Intelligence reports suggest that this pretender has gained support from unexpected quarters. Former Lannister loyalists who see him as preferable to Daenerys, religious fundamentalists who believe any alternative is better than a queen who tolerates heathen faith, and even some former supporters of the Dragon Council who have become disillusioned with its practical implementation. The most troubling aspect of the growing opposition is its increasingly coordinated nature. What began as isolated incidents of resistance and rebellion has evolved into a network of mutual support and shared intelligence. Guild masters pass information to noble conspirators, who share resources with religious underground movements, who provide safe passage for agents working to destabilize the regime. This coordination extends beyond Westeros's border. Intelligence suggests that various opposition groups have made contact with enemies in Essos, former masters seeking revenge, mercenary companies willing to fight for gold, and political rivals who see an opportunity to weaken Daenerys's power base. The prospect of foreign intervention in support of Westerosi rebels represents a threat that Daenerys's military advantages may not be able to address effectively. The psychological toll of constant opposition begins to affect Daenerys personally. The queen, who once freed slaves with decisive action, finds herself constantly questioned, constantly defending decisions that seem obviously just to her. The weight of rulership, combined with the persistent ingratitude of those she seeks to help, begins to erode the idealism that initially motivated her reforms. Tyrion observes with growing concern how the Queen's responses to opposition are becoming increasingly hard. Where she once sought to understand the root causes of resistance, she now increasingly views opposition as evidence of moral failing that must be corrected through force. The benevolent ruler with an iron fist gradually finds the iron growing stronger as the benevolence becomes strained by the constant challenges to her authority. The Dragon Council itself becomes a source of frustration as its democratic deliberations slow down the implementation of reforms that Daenerys considers urgently necessary. When council members debate the fine points of tax policy while people suffer under unjust conditions, her patience wears thin. The temptation to bypass the council and rule by decree grows stronger with each delay, each compromise that waters down what she sees as essential justice. Perhaps most dangerous of all, the opposition's greatest success lies not in organizing armed rebellion, but in gradually convincing Daenerys that her subjects are unworthy of the justice she seeks to provide them. Each act of ingratitude, each preference for familiar oppression over unfamiliar freedom, each choice of traditional prejudice over revolutionary equality, serves to validate the harsh lessons she learned in Essos, that lasting change often requires force, and that mercy is too often mistaken for weakness. The stage is being set for a confrontation that will determine not just the fate of Daenerys's reign, but the very nature of power in Westeros. The Queen's justice, conceived as a system of perfect fairness, faces the ultimate test of whether idealistic principles can survive contact with the messy realities of human nature and political necessity. The dragon may have spared King's Landing in her moment of victory,
But the fires of rebellion threaten to force her hand in ways that her initial mercy may have only delayed, rather than prevented. As opposition grows more organized and resistance becomes more sophisticated, Daenerys faces a choice that will define her legacy, whether to compromise her principles to maintain power, or to use her power to enforce her principles regardless of the cost. The girl who once declared she would break the wheel may find that the wheel's destruction requires methods that transform her into the very thing she sought to replace. Another spoke in an endless cycle of violence and oppression, justified by the noblest of intentions, but sustained by the harshest of necessities.
The victory of Daenerys Targaryen over King's Landing and the subsequent establishment of the Dragon Council system fundamentally altered the power dynamics that had governed Westeros for centuries. The great houses that once commanded absolute authority over vast territories and countless lives now find themselves navigating a transformed political landscape where ancient privileges no longer guarantee continued relevance, and traditional sources of power have been challenged by revolutionary new systems of governance. House Stark emerges from this transformation in perhaps the strongest position of any major house, though not without significant internal tensions and adaptation. Sansa Stark's initial skepticism toward Daenerys gradually transforms into pragmatic cooperation as she recognizes the benefits the new system brings to the North. The Stark tradition of honor and duty to one's people aligns well with the Dragon Council's emphasis on representative governance, allowing Sansa to maintain her family's moral authority while adapting to new political realities. However, this adaptation comes at a cost. Many Northern lords view Sansa's cooperation with the Dragon Council as a betrayal of Northern independence, particularly given the region's historical resistance to Southern rule. The presence of Dothraki and unsullied forces in Northern castles, ostensibly for protection and peacekeeping, serves as a constant reminder that the North's autonomy exists only at the pleasure of the Dragon Queen. Sansa finds herself walking a delicate line between maintaining her people's trust and preventing a rebellion that would certainly result in devastating consequences for the North. The internal dynamics of House Stark reflect these broader tensions. Bran Stark, with his supernatural knowledge and detached perspective, serves as an unofficial advisor to both Sansa and the Dragon Council, his insights proving invaluable in predicting and preventing conflict. However, his otherworldly nature and apparent lack of human emotion increasingly unsettle even his own family members, creating questions about his role in the new order. Arya Stark represents perhaps the most complex case within House Stark. Her skills and experiences make her invaluable to Daenerys' regime as an enforcer and investigator. Yet her independent nature and personal moral code sometimes conflict with royal directives. When tasked with eliminating threats to the regime, Arya must decide whether her loyalty lies with her family's traditional values or her queen's revolutionary vision. Jon Snow's position proves most precarious of all. His Targaryen heritage makes him both an asset and a threat to Daenerys' rule. While their romantic relationship provides personal bonds, the political implications of his bloodline create constant tension. Many who oppose Daenerys' rule see Jon as a preferable alternative, a Targaryen with Stark honor, a male heir in a society still uncomfortable with female rule, and a native of Westeros untainted by foreign influence. House Lannister faces the most dramatic fall from power, yet their response to this reversal reveals the family's adaptability and cunning. With Cersei dead and Jaime stripped of his former status, the burden of preserving Lannister interests falls to Tyrion, whose position as Hand of the Queen places him in an impossible situation. He must serve Daenerys loyally while protecting the remnants of his family's power and the countless lesser nobles, whose fortunes remain tied to Lannister patronage networks. The broader Lannister family adapts to their reduced circumstances with varying degrees of success. Daemon Lannister, elected as the Westerland's noble representative to the Dragon Council, embraces the new system while quietly working to protect family interests. His approach proves pragmatic. Rather than opposing the new order, he seeks to shape it in ways that preserve what he can of traditional Lannister influence. However, the extensive network of Lannister loyalists throughout Westeros creates ongoing challenges for the regime. These lesser nobles, merchants, and administrators owe their positions to Lannister patronage and view the family's fall as a threat to their own status. Their resistance takes subtle forms: bureaucratic delays, economic manipulation, and the gradual erosion of policies they oppose through administrative incompetence disguised as compliance.
The psychological impact on surviving Lannisters proves significant. Accustomed to being feared and respected throughout the Seven Kingdoms, they now find themselves objects of suspicion and contempt. This reversal forces a fundamental re-evaluation of their identity and methods. Some, like Tyrion, channel their talents toward constructive ends within the new system. Others retreat into bitter resentment that may eventually manifest as active opposition.
House Baratheon's situation reflects the broader challenges facing noble houses without clear leadership or strong regional bases. With Robert dead, Stannis dead, and Renly dead, the Baratheon name carries historical weight but lacks practical power. Gendry's legitimization provides a nominal head for the house, but his common origins and lack of political experience make him ill-suited for the complex maneuvering required in Daenerys's new world. This creates an opportunity for ambitious figures to claim influence within the Baratheon sphere. Storm's End becomes a testing ground for the new system as various claimants and advisors compete to guide Gendry's decisions. His genuine desire to help the common folk aligns with Daenerys's goals, but his naivety about political realities makes him vulnerable to manipulation by more experienced players. House Tyrell's extinction creates a power vacuum in the Reach that no single family can fill entirely. The region's wealth and agricultural importance make it crucial to the realm's stability. Yet the absence of clear leadership creates ongoing instability. Various lesser houses, the Tarleys, Hightowers, and others, compete for influence while paying lip service to the Dragon Council system. This competition takes on new dimensions under Daenerys's rule. Rather than the traditional methods of military might and marriage alliances, ambitious houses in the Reach must demonstrate their commitment to the new ideals of justice and representation. This creates opportunities for previously overlooked families who can credibly claim to have always treated their small folk fairly, while punishing those whose reputations are tainted by past abuses. House Martell of Dorne presents unique challenges and opportunities within the new system. Their historical independence and cultural distinctiveness make them natural allies for a queen seeking to transform traditional power structures. However, this same independence makes them wary of any system that might compromise Dornish autonomy, even one that claims to respect regional differences. The Dornish approach to the Dragon Council proves characteristically sophisticated. They embrace the system enthusiastically, in public, while ensuring their representatives coordinate closely to protect Dornish interests. This creates a model that other regions begin to emulate, using the democratic system to preserve traditional regional power rather than being supplanted by it. House Greyjoy faces perhaps the most fundamental challenge to their identity under the new regime. The Iron Islands' traditional economy of reaving and raiding becomes not merely illegal but morally unacceptable under Daenerys's rule. Yara Greyjoy's attempts to transition the Ironborn toward legitimate trade meet resistance from those who view such changes as existential threats to their culture. This resistance manifests in various forms of passive and active opposition. Some Ironborn simply refuse to adapt, continuing traditional practices in defiance of royal edicts. Others embrace change publicly while maintaining old ways in secret. Most dangerously, some begin to organize around the idea that Yara has been corrupted by foreign influence and must be replaced by leaders who will restore the old way. The fate of smaller houses throughout the Seven Kingdoms reflects broader patterns of adaptation and resistance. Those who quickly embrace the new system and demonstrate genuine commitment to its ideals find themselves elevated to positions of influence they never could have achieved under the old order. Houses with reputations for fairness and competence discover that these qualities, once merely admirable, have become essential for political survival. Conversely, houses built on exploitation and abuse find their traditional sources of power rapidly eroding. The ability to call upon sworn swords matters little when those swords are wielded by men whose families have been freed from debt bondage. The right to judge disputes loses meaning when a higher authority reviews every decision for fairness and consistency. This transformation creates a new category of political actor:
the reformed lord. These nobles, recognizing that their survival depends on adaptation, undergo genuine or at least convincing conversions to the new ideal. Their sincerity varies, but their impact on their regions can be substantial as they implement reforms designed to demonstrate their commitment to the Dragon Council's principles. The religious houses and institutions face their own complex adaptation. The faith of the Seven's traditional alliance with noble houses becomes problematic when those houses lose power and influence. The Sept's hierarchy must decide whether to align with the new order or risk becoming irrelevant. Some Septons embrace Daenerys's religious tolerance as an opportunity to demonstrate the faith's universal appeal. Others view it as an assault on the Seven's rightful dominance over Westeros.
The power vacuum created by Daenerys' victory and the transformation of traditional governance creates unprecedented opportunities for figures who would never have achieved prominence under the old system. These newly empowered individuals, drawn from backgrounds previously excluded from political influence, reshape the landscape of Westeros in ways that neither supporters nor opponents of the Dragon Queen anticipated. Perhaps the most significant new power to emerge is the Guild Coalition of King's Landing, led by an unlikely figure, Tobo Mott, the master armorer who once trained Gendry. Under the old system, Mott was merely another craftsman, skilled but politically irrelevant. The Dragon Council's emphasis on economic representation and worker rights transforms him into one of the most influential figures in the capital. Mott's rise illustrates how the new system rewards competence and integrity over birth and wealth. His detailed knowledge of manufacturing processes, fair treatment of apprentices, and ability to coordinate complex projects make him invaluable in the massive reconstruction efforts following the war. More importantly, his common origins and genuine concern for working people give him credibility with constituencies that traditional nobles could never reach. The Guild Coalition under Mott's leadership begins to function almost like a parallel government, coordinating food distribution, organizing public works projects, and mediating disputes between different craft specializations. Their influence extends far beyond King's Landing as guild members throughout the Seven Kingdoms look to them for guidance on adapting to the new economic realities. However, Mott's rise also reveals the potential dangers of new power structure. His increasing influence creates resentment among traditional merchants and nobles, who find their economic activities subject to oversight by a man they consider their social inferior. This resentment manifests in subtle sabotage and economic warfare that threatens the stability of the entire reconstruction effort. From the ranks of the former slaves brought from Essos emerges another unexpected power, Khaleesi, a former bed slave who becomes the unofficial leader of the Essosi community in Westeros. Her rise illustrates the complex dynamics of cultural integration and the challenges of maintaining identity while adapting to new circumstances. Khaleesi's influence stems from her ability to bridge the gap between Essosi and Westerosi culture. Having learned multiple languages during her enslavement and possessing natural intelligence that was never formally educated, she becomes an essential intermediary in countless daily interactions. Her informal network of communication helps prevent the cultural misunderstandings that might otherwise lead to violence. Yet Khaleesi's power also creates new forms of tension. Her authority within the Essosi community sometimes conflicts with official governmental structure. When Essosi residents bring their disputes to her rather than to official courts, she effectively becomes a shadow judicial system operating parallel to the Dragon Council's formal institution. This creates confusion about jurisdiction and authority that threatens the coherence of the new legal system. The most surprising rise to power occurs in the Riverlands, where Angie, the common-born archer who once served in the Brotherhood Without Banners, emerges as a significant political figure. His appointment as the Riverlands common folk representative to the Dragon Council seemed token at first, but his combination of military experience, knowledge of the region's problems, and unwavering moral compass quickly establishes him as a force to be reckoned with. Angie's effectiveness stems from his unique perspective on the region's needs. Having fought alongside both nobles and peasants,
He understands the complex relationships between different social classes in ways that purely academic or aristocratic observers cannot. His proposals for rebuilding war-torn communities reflect practical knowledge gained through years of guerrilla warfare and underground resistance. However, Angui's rise creates its own complication. His history with the Brotherhood Without Banners includes activities that some would classify as banditry, even if motivated by noble goals. Political opponents attempt to use this history to undermine his legitimacy, forcing him to constantly defend past actions while trying to implement present reforms. The military sphere sees the emergence of several new power centers, most notably among the integrated Unsullied and Dothraki forces. Grey Worm's position as commander of the Unsullied makes him one of the most powerful military figures in Westeros, yet his approach to this power reflects his unique background and training. Unlike traditional Westerosi military leaders who view their forces as extensions of personal or familial power, Grey Worm treats his command as a professional responsibility to the realm rather than to any individual. This creates a new model of military service that emphasizes competence and loyalty to institutions, rather than personal relationships. The integration of Dothraki commanders creates different but equally significant changes in military culture. These Horse Lords bring tactical knowledge and combat experience that complement traditional Westerosi approaches to warfare. Their influence extends beyond purely military matters as their cultural emphasis on personal honor and direct action begins to influence political discourse throughout the realm. Perhaps the most complex new power figure is Kinvara, the Red Priestess, who becomes the de facto leader of R'hllor's faith in Westeros. Her arrival with Daenerys' forces and her subsequent establishment of temples throughout the Seven Kingdoms makes her a religious authority rivaling the High Septon in influence, yet operating from a completely different theological and cultural framework.
Kinvara's power derives from her combination of genuine religious conviction, political acumen, and supernatural abilities that convince many of R'hllor's divine favor. Her public demonstrations of fire magic and accurate prophecies attract followers who see the Lord of Light as more responsive and powerful than the traditional Seven. However, her influence also creates the most significant religious tensions since the rise of the faith militant. Her preaching about the eternal struggle between light and darkness implicitly criticizes other faiths as insufficient or corrupt. This theological challenge to established religious authority creates new forms of conflict that transcend traditional political boundaries. The economic sphere produces its own unexpected power figures, most notably Hallan, the former pyromancer who reinvents himself as an industrial innovator. His knowledge of alchemical processes, previously focused on creating wildfire for military purposes, proves invaluable in developing new manufacturing techniques and improving agricultural productivity. Hallan's transformation from maker of weapons to creator of prosperity symbolizes the broader changes occurring throughout Westeros. His workshops become centers of innovation where former pyromancers work alongside craftsmen and scholars to develop new techniques for everything from metalworking to food preservation. Yet his rise also illustrates the ongoing suspicions that new power figures face. Many view him with deep mistrust, remembering the destruction caused by wildfire during previous conflicts. His association with dangerous substances and secretive practices makes him an easy target for those seeking to undermine the New Order's technological advances. The intellectual sphere sees the emergence of Samwell Tarly as a transformative figure whose influence extends far beyond his official position as Grand Maester. His commitment to spreading literacy and education throughout the realm creates networks of knowledge and communication that fundamentally alter how information flows through Westeros. Sam's establishment of schools and libraries in every major settlement creates a new class of educated commoners who can participate in governance and economic activity in previously impossible ways. These newly literate populations become powerful constituencies for continued reform and expansion of democratic participation. However, this intellectual empowerment also creates new forms of resistance. Traditional authorities, from noble houses to religious institutions, find their monopolies on knowledge and interpretation challenged by populations who can now read and think critically for themselves. This democratization of knowledge proves as threatening to established power as any military conquest. The most dangerous new power figure may be Aran Waters,
the bastard who once served as Cersei's master of ships and now commands significant naval forces in the Narrow Sea. His combination of maritime expertise, political connections, and questionable loyalty makes him a wild card in the new political landscape. Waters represents the potential for ambitious individuals to exploit the chaos of transition for personal gain. His ships, officially operating as merchants and peacekeepers, engage in activities that blur the lines between legitimate trade, smuggling, and piracy. His growing fleet and network of ports give him independent power that exists outside the formal structures of the Dragon Council system. His influence extends beyond mere military capability. The ships he controls carry not just goods and passengers, but information and influence between different regions and across the Narrow Sea. This makes him a crucial figure in the ongoing struggle between supporters and opponents of Daenerys's rule, as both sides seek to use his services while fearing his ultimate allegiances.
The transformation of Westeros under Daenerys's rule creates a complex web of relationships between traditional power holders and newly risen figures that defies simple categorization. These alliances and rivalries, formed across old boundaries of class, region, and culture, reshape the political landscape in ways that make the future increasingly unpredictable and the stability of the new order constantly in question. The most significant alliance emerges between Sansa Stark and Tobbo Mott, representing a partnership between traditional noble authority and new economic power. Sansa recognizes that the North's recovery depends on industrial and agricultural development that requires skills the Guild Coalition possesses. Mott understands that his influence needs political legitimacy that Stark authority can provide. Their collaboration begins with practical projects, improving northern mines, developing new agricultural techniques, and establishing trade networks that connect northern resources with southern markets. However, the partnership gradually evolves into something more complex, as both parties recognize their mutual dependence in the new political environment. This alliance proves mutually beneficial but also creates new tension. Northern lords who remained loyal to House Stark throughout the wars find themselves subordinated to guild masters and craftsmen whose families they once considered barely above peasants. The traditional hierarchy that placed warriors above workers becomes increasingly untenable as economic productivity proves more valuable than military prowess. Conversely, guild members who embrace the alliance with northern nobility face criticism from their own constituencies, who view such cooperation as betrayal of working-class interests. The alliance forces both sides to navigate carefully between maintaining their core supporters and building bridges across traditional division. A more surprising partnership develops between Tyrion Lannister and Grey Worm, uniting the cunning of Westerosi political culture with the disciplined efficiency of unsullied military organization. Their collaboration emerges from practical necessity as they work together to implement Daenerys's more controversial policies, but gradually develops into genuine mutual respect. Tyrion's role as Hand requires him to translate the Queen's idealistic visions into practical policies, while Grey Worm must implement these policies through military and administrative structures. Their different backgrounds and approaches complement each other as Tyrion's political subtlety helps navigate complex social situations while Grey Worm's straightforward honesty cuts through deception and manipulation. However, this alliance also illustrates the cultural tensions inherent in the new order. Tyrion's traditional approach to politics, built on compromise, negotiation, and the careful balancing of competing interests, sometimes conflicts with Grey Worm's absolute commitment to duty and justice. These philosophical differences create ongoing friction that reflects broader challenges in integrating Essosi and Westerosi approaches to governance. The religious sphere produces perhaps the most volatile alliance, as Kinvara and certain reform-minded Septons find common ground in their shared opposition to religious orthodoxy. These progressive elements within the faith of the Seven recognize that adapting to Daenerys's religious tolerance offers opportunities to reform practices they consider corrupt or harmful. This unlikely partnership focuses on practical cooperation rather than theological agreement. Both groups support expanded rights for women, opposition to slavery in all its forms, and increased attention to the needs of the poor and marginalized. Their collaboration creates new forms of religious expression that blend elements from different traditions while maintaining distinct identities. Yet this religious alliance also generates the most intense opposition from traditional authorities within both faiths. Orthodox septons view cooperation with foreign priests as heretical compromise with heathen influences. Similarly, some followers of Ruler consider any accommodation with the Seven as dilution of their faith's pure message. The economic sphere creates complex alliances that transcend traditional regional and class boundaries. Holony's industrial innovations attract support from unexpected quarters as lords who need new technologies to improve their lands find themselves partnering with a former pyromancer whose knowledge they would once have dismissed as mere alchemy. These partnerships prove mutually beneficial as traditional landholders provide resources and political protection, while innovative craftsmen supply technical expertise and new methods. The collaboration accelerates economic development throughout Westeros as established wealth combines with new knowledge to create unprecedented prosperity in many regions. However, these economic alliances also create new forms of competition and rivalry. Regions that successfully implement industrial innovations gain significant advantages over those that resist change, creating economic disparities that translate into political tensions. The benefits of cooperation become so significant that those excluded from such partnerships find themselves increasingly disadvantaged. Perhaps the most dangerous alliance emerges between Oreen Waters and certain ambitious members of established noble houses who see the naval commander as a vehicle for regaining lost influence. These partnerships operate largely in shadow, using Waters' ships and networks to coordinate opposition to Daenerys' regime while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. This alliance proves particularly effective because it combines Waters' practical capabilities with the political knowledge and connections of experienced nobles. His ships can transport messages, gold, and even people between different centers of opposition, while the noble partners provide strategic guidance and legitimacy for resistance activities. The most complex rivalry develops between Samwell Tarly and traditional maesters, who view his educational reforms as threats to their monopoly on knowledge and learning. While Sam's official position as Grand Maester gives him authority over the order, many maesters resist his efforts to democratize education and spread literacy among the common population. This conflict reflects broader tensions about the role of knowledge in society. Traditional maesters view themselves as guardians of learning, who must carefully control how information is shared to prevent chaos and misunderstanding. Sam's approach treats knowledge as a tool for empowerment that should be made available to all who can benefit from it. The rivalry manifests in subtle forms of resistance as traditional maesters implement Sam's directives slowly or incompletely, finding technical reasons to delay or modify educational programs. This bureaucratic opposition proves more effective than open rebellion as it undermines reform efforts while avoiding direct confrontation with royal authority. Regional alliances create new power blocks that sometimes conflict with the central authority of the Dragon Council. The partnership between Dornish representatives and certain Reach nobles creates a southern alliance focused on agricultural and trade interests that sometimes opposes northern priorities related to defense and winter preparation. These regional coalitions reflect natural geographic and economic interests, but they also create the potential for larger conflicts if regional priorities diverge significantly from royal policy. The Dragon Council system, designed to represent diverse interests, sometimes amplifies these differences rather than resolving them. The most intriguing alliance emerges between Arya Stark and Khaleesi, representing a partnership between Westerosi independence and SOC adaptation. Both women operate outside traditional power structures while wielding significant informal influence, and their collaboration creates new possibilities for addressing problems that formal institutions struggle to handle. Their partnership proves particularly effective in managing cultural conflicts between SOC immigrants and Westerosi population. Arya's ability to move unseen through different social circles, combined with Khaleesi's deep understanding of SOC customs and concerns, allows them to identify and resolve tensions before they escalate into violence. However, this alliance also represents a potential challenge to formal authority structures. When Arya and Khaleesi resolve disputes through informal mediation rather than official channels,
they create precedents that could undermine the Dragon Council's legal authority. Their effectiveness in solving problems sometimes comes at the cost of institutional legitimacy. The military sphere produces rivalries that reflect broader cultural tensions within Daenerys's forces. Traditional Westerosi knights, despite their integration into the new military structure, maintain subtle resentments toward Dothraki and unsullied commanders who hold positions of authority over them. These rivalries rarely manifest as open confrontation, but they create ongoing tensions that affect military efficiency and morale. Competing approaches to training, discipline, and combat tactics reflect deeper cultural differences that integration efforts have not fully resolved. Perhaps the most significant long-term rivalry develops between Jon Snow and various newly empowered figures who see him as a threat to their continued influence. His Targaryen bloodline and Stark connections make him a natural alternative to Daenerys for those who support the New Order's goals but oppose its methods or leadership. This creates a complex dynamic where Jon finds himself reluctantly at the center of political maneuvering, despite his personal preference for avoiding such conflict. His very existence as an alternative source of legitimacy makes him a focal point for opposition that he neither seeks nor particularly wants to address. The evolution of these alliances and rivalries will ultimately determine whether Daenerys's revolutionary transformation of Westeros can achieve lasting stability or whether the tensions inherent in such dramatic change will eventually tear apart the new order she has worked so hard to create. The interplay between established and emerging powers creates possibilities for both unprecedented cooperation and devastating conflict, making the future of the Seven Kingdoms more uncertain than ever before in their long and turbulent history.
In the smoldering ruins of King's Landing, as the bells of surrender rang across the Seven Kingdoms, Daenerys Targaryen stood triumphant atop the Iron Throne. The wheel she had promised to break lay shattered at her feet. But in its place, something new and terrible had been forged. This is not the story we know. This is the story of what might have been. Had the Mother of Dragons lived to rule the realm she had conquered with fire and blood, the victory came at a cost that would echo through generations. The capital city bore the scars of dragon fire, half its population reduced to ash, the other half living in the shadow of what their queen was capable of when crossed. Yet from these ashes, Daenerys sought to build something unprecedented, a truly unified Westeros, free from the feudal chains that had bound it for millennia. But power, as the Targaryens learned long ago, is a double-edged sword, and dragons, no matter how noble their intentions, cast long shadows. In the months following her conquest, Daenerys faced the monumental task of governing a kingdom that both feared and needed her. The destruction of King's Landing had sent shockwaves throughout Westeros. Lords who had never bent the knee now found themselves calculating the cost of resistance against the terrible arithmetic of dragonfire. Her first acts as queen were telling. The surviving nobles of King's Landing were given a choice: bend the knee and help rebuild, or face the fate of those who had defied her. Most chose submission, but it was a submission born of terror rather than love. The Red Keep, partially destroyed in the conquest, was rebuilt not as a monument to Targaryen power, but as something new, a palace open to petitioners from all walks of life, where former slaves could seek audience alongside Lord. Daenerys established the Council of Voices, drawing representatives from every corner of the realm, including former slaves, merchants, crafters, and yes, nobles. But nobles who now served at the pleasure of the crown rather than by birthright. This revolutionary restructuring sent tremors through the established order. Old Town's maesters whispered of precedent and tradition. The faith militants stirred uneasily. And in the north, where Jon Snow's true parentage remained a closely guarded secret among a few, Sansa Stark watched and waited. The Queen's approach to justice was swift and absolute. Corruption among officials was met with exile or death. Slavery in all its forms, including the indentured servitude that had long been tolerated in Westeros, was abolished completely. Masters who had profited from human misery found their assets seized and redistributed to their former victims. It was radical. It was unprecedented. And it worked, but only through the implicit threat of draconic intervention. Daenerys had promised to break the wheel, and she set about doing so with methodical determination.
The feudal system that had defined Westeros for thousands of years was systematically dismantled. No longer would lords rule over small folk by divine right or ancient privilege. Instead, a new system emerged. One part democracy, one part meritocracy, held together by the iron will of a queen who commanded dragons. Land redistribution became the cornerstone of her domestic policy. The vast holdings of houses that had opposed her were broken up and granted to the common people who worked them. Former serfs became landowners overnight, while displaced nobles were offered positions in the new bureaucracy, provided they could prove their competence rather than simply their bloodline. The changes were seismic, reaching into every corner of the realm. Education, long the privilege of the highborn, was declared a right of all citizens. Schools were established in every major town and village, funded by the crown and staffed by maesters who had sworn new oaths, not to serve lords, but to serve knowledge itself. The curriculum was revolutionary. Alongside traditional subjects like history and healing, students learned about governance, law, and their rights as citizens of the realm. The faith of the Seven found itself in an uncomfortable position. Daenerys, while not openly hostile to religion, made it clear that no faith would be permitted to accumulate political power. The High Sparrows movement had been crushed along with Cersei's regime, but the underlying tensions between temporal and spiritual authority remained. The Queen's solution was elegant in its simplicity. Complete religious freedom coupled with complete separation of church and state. Temples could teach their faithful, but they could not levy taxes, maintain armies, or influence policy. Perhaps nowhere were the complexities of Daenerys' reign more apparent than in her relationship with the North. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, remained her most trusted advisor and, in the eyes of many, her heir apparent. Their relationship, both political and personal, became the subject of endless speculation throughout the realm. Some whispered of a royal marriage that would unite ice and fire. Others spoke of tension between duty and desire. The North itself remained a study in contradictions under Daenerys' rule. Sansa Stark, as Wardeness of Winterfell, maintained a careful balance between loyalty to the crown and loyalty to northern independence. The region had been granted significant autonomy in recognition of its role in the wars against the dead. But this autonomy existed at the pleasure of the Dragon Queen. It was an arrangement that satisfied no one completely, yet somehow held together through mutual necessity. The revelation of Jon's true parentage, when it finally came to light, threatened to destabilize everything. Daenerys handled the crisis with characteristic decisiveness. She publicly acknowledged Jon as her nephew and co-heir, binding him to her reign through blood as well as love. The gesture was both magnanimous and politically shrewd, transforming a potential rival into a pillar of support. Yet it also raised questions about succession that would plague the realm for generations to come. Northern lords, particularly those who remembered the independence they had briefly enjoyed, found themselves in an impossible position. Open rebellion would invite dragonfire. Submission meant accepting the end of their ancient privileges. Most chose a middle path, paying lip service to the crown while quietly maintaining their traditional ways. It was a compromise that worked, but barely, and only under the watchful eyes of dragons.
The economic transformation of Westeros under Daenerys' rule was as radical as her political reforms. The Queen understood that lasting change required more than new laws. It required new ways of thinking about wealth, power, and prosperity. Her approach was both pragmatic and idealistic, drawing on her experiences in Essos while adapting to Westerosi realities. Trade was revolutionized almost overnight. The Crown negotiated new agreements with the free cities, leveraging Daenerys' reputation and the fear of her dragons to secure favorable terms. Braavos, initially skeptical of the new regime, was won over by the Queen's commitment to ending slavery and her willingness to honor the Iron Bank's debts. Pentos and Myr found their slaving operations strangled by Westerosi naval patrols, while Volantis was forced to reconsider its entire economic model. Within Westeros, the guild system was reformed to prevent the concentration of wealth and power that had characterized the old order. Crafters and merchants were encouraged to form cooperatives, sharing profits and decision-making in ways that would have seemed impossible under the feudal system. The Queen's own experiences as a liberator informed these policies, She had seen how economic freedom could transform lives, and she was determined to extend that transformation to her new subjects. The cost of these changes was enormous. Rebuilding King's Landing alone required resources that strained the crown's finances. The land redistribution program, while popular among the common people, disrupted agricultural production in the short term. Trade disruptions with reluctant partners in Essos created shortages of luxury goods that angered the remaining nobility. Yet the queen pressed on, convinced that short-term pain would yield long-term prosperity. Infrastructure became a royal priority. Roads were improved and expanded, connecting previously isolated regions to the broader realm. Ravens were supplemented by a network of signal fires and mounted messengers, creating a communication system that allowed the crown to respond quickly to problems anywhere in the Seven Kingdoms. Harbors were dredged and expanded, facilitating the trade that would fund the queen's ambitious programs. Justice under Daenerys took on a character unlike anything Westeros had previously known. The queen's experiences in Slaver's Bay had taught her that true justice required more than punishment. It required understanding, rehabilitation, and sometimes mercy. Yet her methods remained uncompromisingly decisive when circumstances demanded. The legal system was fundamentally restructured. Trial by combat, long a cornerstone of Westerosi justice, was abolished in favor of tribunals composed of trained jurists. These judges, drawn from all social classes and appointed based on merit, rather than birth, were tasked with applying a new legal code that emphasized fairness over tradition. The code itself was revolutionary, establishing rights for all citizens regardless of their birth or station. Crime, particularly crimes against the vulnerable, was met with swift and terrible justice. Lords who abused their remaining privileges found themselves stripped of lands and titles. Merchants who cheated their customers faced fines that could bankrupt them. Violence against women, children, or the formerly enslaved was punished with exile or death. The queen's justice was harsh, but it was also predictable and impartial in ways that the old system had never. The establishment of a professional constabulary, answerable to the crown rather than local lords, marked another break with tradition. These King's Guards, as they came to be known, were recruited from all walks of life, and trained not just in combat, but in law, investigation, and conflict resolution. They became the visible face of royal authority in communities throughout the realm, symbols of the new order's reach and determination. Perhaps most controversially, Daenerys established a system of royal pardons for those who had committed crimes under the old system, but who could demonstrate genuine reform. Former bandits became road wardens, smugglers became customs officials. Even some who had served the previous regime found places in the new order. It was a policy that infuriated traditionalists, but proved remarkably effective at reducing recidivism and building loyalty to the crown. The cultural impact of Daenerys's reign extended far beyond politics and economics. The queen's own journey from exile to conqueror captured the imagination of bards and storytellers throughout the realm, spawning a new literary tradition that celebrated transformation, redemption, and the possibility of change. Yet this cultural revolution was not without its controversies and contradictions. The destruction of King's Landing became a subject of intense artistic interpretation. Some portrayed it as a necessary tragedy, the price of breaking the chains of oppression. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. The queen herself seemed to struggle with how to commemorate the event, eventually settling on a memorial that honored both the dead and the ideals that their sacrifice had supposedly served. Education reforms had profound effects on Westerosi culture. For the first time in history, common people had access to reading and writing, opening up new possibilities for artistic expression and political participation. Folk songs and stories that had previously existed only in oral tradition were written down and preserved. New voices emerged from previously silenced populations, telling stories that challenged traditional narratives about heroism, nobility, and power. The queen's own multicultural background influenced court culture in unexpected ways. Dothraki customs blended with Valyrian traditions and Westerosi practices, creating something entirely new. The royal court became a cosmopolitan center, where ideas from across the known world
could be shared and debated. This cultural fusion was not always smooth. Traditionalists complained about foreign influences, corrupting pure Westerosi culture, but it undeniably enriched the realm's intellectual and artistic life. Religious and philosophical traditions also evolved under the new regime. The faith of the Seven adapted to its reduced political role by focusing more intensively on spiritual matters. New religious movements emerged, some syncretistic faiths that blended different traditions, others entirely novel belief systems that attempted to make sense of a world where dragons had returned and the old certainties had been shattered.
Perhaps nowhere was the long-term impact of Daenerys's reign more apparent than in its effects on the children who grew up under the new system. These young people, the first generation to know only the post-feudal world, represented both the greatest promise and the greatest challenge of the Queen's legacy. In the newly established schools, children from all backgrounds learned together for the first time in Westerosi history. The son of a former lord might sit beside the daughter of a former slave, both receiving the same education and competing for the same opportunities. This social mixing produced a generation that was more cosmopolitan and less bound by traditional hierarchies than any that had come before. Yet this new generation also grew up in the shadow of dragons and the memory of King's Landing. They understood power in ways their parents never had, not as something inherited or earned through virtue, but as something that could reshape the world through will and force. Some embraced this understanding, becoming passionate advocates for continued reform and expansion of the Queen's ideals. Others recoiled from it, seeking to restore older, simpler certainties. The question of succession haunted these young people's development. Daenerys and Jon remained childless years into the reign, leading to endless speculation about the future of the dynasty. Some of the new generation saw this as an opportunity. Perhaps the next ruler would come from among them, chosen by merit rather than blood. Others worried about the instability that might follow when the dragons finally died and the realm had to govern itself without their terrifying protection. Education in the new system emphasized critical thinking and civic engagement in ways that would have been unthinkable under the old order. Young people were taught to question authority, to demand justification for laws and policies, and to see themselves as active participants in governance rather than passive subjects. These lessons produced a generation of engaged citizens, but also one that was more difficult to govern and more likely to challenge even beneficial authority. The impact of Daenerys's reign varied dramatically across the different regions of Westeros, reflecting local traditions, economic conditions, and the varying enthusiasm with which her reforms were received. These regional differences created a complex patchwork of compliance, resistance, and adaptation that would define the realm's political landscape for generations. In the Reach, long Westeros's breadbasket, the land redistribution policies had profound effect. The great houses that had once controlled vast territories found their holdings broken up among their former tenants, creating a new class of small farmers who owed their prosperity directly to the crown. This transformation was generally successful, increasing agricultural productivity and creating a loyal base of support for the regime. However, it also disrupted established trade relationships and created tensions between the new landowners and the remaining nobility. Dorne, with its history of resistance to Targaryen rule, presented unique challenges. The Dornish had always been proud of their differences from the rest of Westeros, and many viewed the Queen's reforms as another attempt at cultural imperialism. Yet Daenerys's policies of religious tolerance and women's equality resonated strongly with Dornish values. The result was a complex relationship where Dorne supported many of the Queen's initiatives while maintaining its distinct identity and semi-autonomous status. The Iron Islands represented perhaps the greatest challenge to the new order. Their traditional economy of raiding and reaving was completely incompatible with Daenerys's vision of a peaceful, prosperous realm. The Queen's solution was characteristically direct. She offered the Ironborn a choice between transformation and destruction. Most chose transformation, channeling their maritime skills into trade and exploration rather than piracy. The process was not smooth, and several minor rebellions had to be crushed before the islands fully accepted their new role. The Vale, protected by its geography and traditional conservatism,
adapted more slowly to the new order. The Mountain Lords were among the last to fully implement the Queen's reforms, often finding creative ways to maintain traditional hierarchies under new names. This resistance was tolerated as long as it remained passive and didn't interfere with broader royal policies, but it created pockets of the old world that would prove troublesome in later years. Daenerys's reign fundamentally altered Westeros's relationship with the rest of the known world. The return of dragons and the establishment of a unified, militarily powerful kingdom under radical new leadership sent shockwaves throughout Essos and beyond. The Queen's foreign policy balanced her idealistic commitment to ending slavery with the practical necessities of governance and trade. The free cities found themselves in an impossible position. Their economies had long depended on slave labor and the trade in human beings. But the Dragon Queen's anti-slavery crusade made such practices increasingly dangerous. Braavos, which had never allowed slavery, became a natural ally and the primary intermediary for trade between Westeros and the eastern continent. Other cities were forced to choose between their traditional practices and access to Westerosi markets. Slavers' Bay remained a key focus of Daenerys' attention even after her conquest of Westeros. The Queen maintained a significant naval presence in the region, supporting the new governments she had established and preventing the resurgence of slavery. This ongoing commitment required substantial resources and occasionally led to conflicts with other powers, but it also established Westeros as the foremost anti-slavery power in the world. The relationship with the surviving Dothraki Khalasars was particularly complex. Many had followed their Khaleesi to Westeros and settled there, becoming part of the new order. Others remained in Essos, continuing their traditional nomadic lifestyle but now under the protection of the Dragon Queen. This created a unique situation where Westeros effectively had an imperial presence in Essos, though one based on ideology rather than territorial conquest. New trade routes opened as the Queen's diplomatic efforts bore fruit. Westeros began importing not just goods but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices from across the known world. This influx of foreign influences accelerated the cultural transformation already underway within the realm, creating new opportunities but also new tensions between traditionalists and progressives.
The destruction of King's Landing cast a long shadow over Daenerys' reign, serving as both a symbol of her power and a reminder of its terrible cost. The event became a defining moment in Westerosi history, but its interpretation remained fiercely contested throughout the Queen's rule and beyond. For the Queen's supporters, King's Landing represented a necessary tragedy, the price of breaking free from centuries of oppression and injustice. They pointed to the prosperity and freedom that followed, arguing that the short-term cost was justified by the long-term benefits. Memorial services focused on the idea of rebirth through fire, drawing on both Targaryen tradition and the Queen's own experiences of triumph through adversity. Critics of the regime saw the destruction very differently. For them, it was evidence of the Queen's tyrannical nature and a warning about the dangers of absolute power. They argued that no political goal could justify the wholesale slaughter of innocents, and they kept alive the memory of those who had died as a check against future excesses. Underground songs and stories preserved alternative narratives about the conquest, often portraying the Queen as a foreign invader who had destroyed the realm's ancient traditions. The physical reconstruction of the city became a symbol of these competing interpretations. The new King's Landing was more beautiful and more equitable than the old, with wide streets, public spaces, and housing for all social classes. Yet the construction revealed the bones of the old city, the foundations and cellars that had survived the dragonfire. These remnants served as constant reminders of what had been lost, even as they were incorporated into something new. Survivors of the destruction found themselves in a unique position within the new order. Many had lost everything but were offered opportunities to rebuild and participate in the transformed society. Some embraced these opportunities, becoming vocal supporters of the regime. Others remained bitter and resentful, forming the core of opposition movements that would persist throughout the Queen's reign. Central to everything was the question of the dragons themselves. Drogon, the last of his kind after the deaths of his brothers,
became more than just a weapon or a means of transportation. He was a living symbol of the Queen's power and the transformed nature of the world. Yet dragons are mortal creatures, and the knowledge that Drogon would eventually die cast a shadow over all of Daenerys's plans. The Queen's relationship with her dragon evolved throughout her reign. In the early years, Drogon had been primarily an instrument of conquest and control. His presence alone enough to quell most opposition. As the realm stabilized, however, his role became more ceremonial. Public appearances became carefully choreographed events designed to remind the population of the crown's ultimate power, while also demonstrating the Queen's control over that power. Attempts to breed dragons or find dragon eggs became a constant preoccupation of the royal court. Expeditions were sent to Valyria and other ancient sites, searching for any means of ensuring the continuation of the Targaryen dragons. These efforts were largely unsuccessful, leading to growing anxiety about what would happen when Drogon inevitably died. The Queen aged visibly under this pressure, knowing that her entire political system depended on a single mortal creature. The symbolic power of dragons extended far beyond their military utility. They represented the return of magic to a world that had nearly forgotten it. The possibility of transformation and transcendence that lay at the heart of the Queen's message. Children born under the reign grew up with dragons as a natural part of their world, creating a generation that saw magic and transformation as possible rather than legendary. Yet the dragons also represented the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Daenerys's reign. She had promised to break the wheel of oppression, but her entire system depended on the threat of dragonfire. She had established rights and freedoms for all citizens, but those rights existed only at the pleasure of someone who commanded the ultimate weapon. This paradox would define her legacy and shape the challenges faced by her successors. As Daenerys's reign progressed, the question of how she would be remembered became increasingly important. The Queen herself was acutely aware of her place in history, having grown up with stories of her ancestors' greatness and madness. She was determined to be remembered as a liberator rather than a conqueror, but she understood that history would judge her by results rather than intention. The establishment of new historical traditions became a priority for the regime. Official histories emphasized the Queen's role as a breaker of chains and a champion of the oppressed. These accounts focused on the positive changes brought about by her reign: the end of slavery, the expansion of education and opportunity, the creation of a more just legal system. The destruction of King's Landing was acknowledged but contextualized within the broader narrative of necessary change. Alternative histories persisted despite official efforts to control the narrative. Bards and storytellers in remote regions continued to tell older versions of events, often portraying the Queen as a foreign invader who had destroyed traditional Westerosi culture. These unofficial histories preserved different perspectives on the conquest and its aftermath, ensuring that future generations would have access to multiple interpretations of these crucial events. The Queen's personal story became the subject of countless ballads, poems, and tales. Her journey from exile to conquest captured the imagination of people throughout the realm and beyond. Some versions emphasized her role as a liberator, focusing on her struggles against slavery and oppression. Others portrayed her as a tragic figure, corrupted by power and ultimately destroyed by her own contradictions. International perspectives on Daenerys's reign varied widely. In the Free Cities, she was often portrayed as a destructive force who had disrupted centuries of profitable trade relationships. In regions where slavery was still practiced, she was remembered as a dangerous radical whose ideas threatened the established order. But in places where her anti-slavery crusade had succeeded, she was celebrated as a champion of freedom and human dignity.
Perhaps the greatest challenge facing Daenerys's reign was the question of what would happen after she was gone. The Queen and Jon Snow remained childless, and the dynasty's future remained uncertain. This uncertainty created both opportunities and dangers for the transformed realm. Various succession models were debated throughout the reign. Some proposed a return to traditional hereditary monarchy, with Jon Snow as the natural heir. Others suggested an elective system, where the nobility would choose each new ruler from among qualified candidates. More radical voices proposed abandoning monarchy altogether in favor of some form of representative government. The queen herself seemed torn between different approaches. Her democratic instincts favored a more participatory system, but her pragmatic side recognized that only strong central authority could maintain the radical changes she had implemented. The dragons provided that authority, but their mortality meant that any successor would have to govern through different means. Preparation for the post-dragon era became a central focus of royal policy in the later years of Daenerys' reign. Administrative systems were strengthened to reduce dependence on royal intervention. The military was professionalized and institutionalized to prevent regional strongmen from seizing power. Legal and educational reforms were deepened to create a population capable of self-governance. Yet uncertainty remained. The new order had been created through force and maintained through the threat of force. Whether it could survive the transition to a post-dragon world remained an open question that would define the ultimate success or failure of the Queen's revolutionary project. In the end, Daenerys Targaryen's hypothetical victory and reign would have raised fundamental questions about the nature of power, justice, and human society that resonate far beyond the fictional world of Westeros. Her story, one of liberation achieved through conquest, of justice imposed through force, of democracy established by decree, embodies the central paradoxes of political transformation. The Queen's legacy would have been complex and contradictory. She would have been remembered as both a liberator and a destroyer, a champion of the oppressed and a wielder of terrible power. Her reign would have demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers of radical change imposed from above. The institutions she created might have survived her death, evolving into something more democratic and sustainable, or they might have collapsed without the dragons that had made them possible. What remains clear is that such a reign would have fundamentally altered not just the political landscape of Westeros, but its entire social and cultural fabric. The children who grew up under the Dragon Queen's rule would have been different from any generation that had come before. More educated, more equal, more aware of their rights and possibilities, but also more conscious of power's capacity for both creation and destruction. The shadow cast by such a reign would have extended far into the future, shaping debates about governance, justice, and the proper relationship between rulers and ruled for generations to come. Whether that shadow would have been seen as protective or threatening would have depended largely on one's perspective and position within the new order. In contemplating this alternative history, we are forced to confront our own assumptions about political change, the nature of justice, and the price we are willing to pay for transformation. Daenerys Targaryen's story, whether ending in victory or defeat, remains a powerful meditation on the eternal human struggle to balance power with justice, order with freedom, and the needs of the present with the hopes of the future. The dragons may have been mythical, but the questions they raise about power, authority, and social change remain eternally relevant. In the end, that may be the most lasting legacy of all, not the specific political arrangements that might have emerged from the Dragon Queen's victory, but the enduring questions about human nature and society that her story continues to provoke. History is littered with rulers who believed they were saving their people, only to discover that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. In contemplating Daenerys Targaryen's hypothetical victory and subsequent reign over Westeros, we must look beyond the immediate political ramifications to examine the deeper, more insidious consequences that would have emerged from her revolutionary transformation of the Seven Kingdoms. The Dragon Queen's victory would have set in motion a cascade of unforeseen changes that would have rippled through every aspect of Westerosi society, creating new problems even as they solved old ones. These consequences, some beneficial, others catastrophic, would have fundamentally altered not just the political landscape, but the very soul of the realm and its people. What emerges from this analysis is a sobering reminder that radical change, no matter how well-intentioned, inevitably produces outcomes that its architects never anticipated. The wheel that Daenerys promised to break would have been replaced not by the just society she envisioned, but by something far more complex and potentially more dangerous. One of the most profound, unforeseen consequences of Daenerys' victory would have been its psychological impact on the very people she sought to liberate. The sudden transition from feudal servitude to radical freedom would have created a generation of individuals psychologically unprepared for the responsibilities and choices that freedom demands. Centuries of feudalism had created a population accustomed to hierarchy, deference, and clearly defined social roles. The small folk knew their place in society, understood their obligations, and found meaning within established structure. Daenerys' reforms would have shattered these psychological frameworks overnight, leaving millions of people adrift in a world where the old certainties no longer applied. The phenomenon of liberation trauma would have manifested in various ways throughout the realm. Former serfs, suddenly granted land and freedom, would have struggled with decision-making paralysis. Without lords to tell them what to plant, when to harvest, or how to organize their communities, many would have floundered. Some would have voluntarily returned to servitude-like arrangements, trading their newfound freedom for the security of familiar structures. More troubling still would have been the emergence of what psychologists might term revolutionary guilt. Many of the common people who benefited from Daenerys' reforms would have done so only because others, nobles, merchants, and even fellow commoners, had suffered losses. The weight of knowing that their improved circumstances came at such a terrible cost would have created a pervasive sense of unease and moral uncertainty that would have undermined the very foundations of the new order. The children of this transformation would have faced their own unique psychological challenge. Growing up in a world where their parents spoke in whispers about the old days, they would have inherited a form of cultural trauma that manifested as either excessive gratitude toward the crown or deep-seated resentment about their inherited burden of revolutionary debt. Perhaps nowhere would the unforeseen consequences of Daenerys' victory have been more dramatically illustrated than in the transformation of the surviving aristocracy. Rather than simply disappearing, many noble houses would have adapted to the new order in ways that ultimately subverted its revolutionary intent. The most cunning survivors of the old regime would have recognized that titles and bloodlines meant nothing in the new world. What mattered was competence, loyalty to the crown, and the ability to navigate the complex bureaucracy that Daenerys had established. These former nobles would have thrown themselves into mastering the new system with the same energy they had once devoted to courtly intrigue. Within a generation, a new aristocracy would have emerged, one based not on birth, but on revolutionary credentials and administrative competence. Former lords who had bent the knee early and demonstrated their commitment to the Queen's ideals would have found themselves occupying positions of significant power within the new government. Their children, educated in the new schools and trained in the new values, would have become the most effective administrators and advocates for the revolutionary system. This red nobility, as they might have been called, would have posed a unique threat to the democratic ideals underlying Daenerys' reforms. Having learned to thrive within the new system, they would have had every incentive to maintain and expand it, but on their own terms. Over time, they would have begun to close ranks, creating informal networks and unspoken understandings that would have gradually re-established many of the exclusionary practices that the revolution had supposedly eliminated. The ultimate irony would have been that the most effective defenders of Daenerys' legacy would have been drawn from the very class she had sought to overthrow. Their success within the new system would have legitimized it in ways that common-born officials never could, but it would also have gradually corrupted its egalitarian principle. The return of dragons and the establishment of Daenerys' revolutionary regime would have triggered a religious and spiritual crisis throughout Westeros that would have had consequences far beyond the political realm. The reappearance of magic in a world that had largely forgotten it would have forced every faith tradition to reconsider its fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, divinity, and human purpose. The faith of the Seven, long the dominant religion in southern Westeros, would have faced an existential crisis. The dragons were living proof that the old Valyrian gods, or at least their magic, retained power in the world. Some Septons would have proclaimed this as evidence of divine judgment, declaring that the Seven had sent dragons to punish the realm for its sins. Others would have gone further, incorporating dragon symbolism into their theology and declaring Daenerys a chosen instrument of divine. More radical religious movements would have emerged, synthesizing elements of various faith traditions with the undeniable reality of draconic power. These new faiths would have attracted followers from all social classes,
offering spiritual explanations for the political upheavals that had transformed their world. Some would have been benign, focusing on themes of renewal and transformation. Others would have been militantly apocalyptic, viewing the dragons as harbingers of the end times. The most significant unforeseen consequence would have been the emergence of dragon cults that venerated Daenerys herself as a divine figure. Despite her own discomfort with such worship, these movements would have grown beyond her control, particularly in regions where her reforms had been most transformative. The psychological need to understand and worship power would have proven stronger than any official discouragement. These religious developments would have created new forms of social division and conflict that would have complicated efforts to build a unified, secular religious violence, rare in the original series except during the Faith Militant Uprising, would have become a persistent problem as competing interpretations of the dragon's significance clashed with each other and with official policy.
Daenerys's economic reforms, while successful in many respects, would have generated unforeseen consequences that would have fundamentally altered Westeros's relationship with wealth, work, and social mobility. The destruction of the old feudal system and its replacement with more egalitarian economic structures would have created a paradoxical situation where increased prosperity coexisted with increased instability. The land redistribution program, one of the Queen's most popular policies, would have had complex effects on agricultural productivity. While many former serfs would have thrived as independent farmers, others would have lacked the knowledge, resources, or temperament necessary for successful land management. The result would have been a patchwork of highly productive small farms and abandoned or poorly managed plots, leading to regional food shortages despite overall increased production. More problematically, the breakup of large estates would have disrupted established trade networks and supply chains. Merchants who had dealt with a few major landowners would have been forced to negotiate with hundreds of small farmers, dramatically increasing transaction costs and reducing efficiency. Some regions would have experienced temporary famines not because of poor harvests, but because of the logistical challenges of moving food from producers to consumers. The Queen's prohibition on slavery and various forms of indentured servitude would have had unforeseen effects on industries that had traditionally relied on such labor. The mining operations in the Westerlands, the textile production in the Reach, and various manufacturing enterprises throughout the realm would have faced severe labor shortages. Some would have adapted by offering higher wages and better working conditions, but others would have simply shut down, leading to unemployment and economic disruption in regions that had depended on these industries. Perhaps most significantly, the new economic system would have created unprecedented opportunities for corruption and abuse. Officials responsible for distributing land and resources would have wielded enormous power over people's lives, creating temptations that many would have found irresistible. The absence of traditional oversight mechanisms would have made such corruption difficult to detect and punish, potentially undermining the entire system from within. The most profound and lasting unforeseen consequence of Daenerys's victory would have been its impact on the children who grew up under her regime. This generation, born into freedom but raised on stories of oppression, would have developed a relationship with power, authority, and social change that would have been fundamentally different from anything previously seen in Westeros. These children would have been educated in schools that emphasized critical thinking, individual rights, and civic participation. They would have grown up believing that they had the right to question authority, to demand justification for laws and policies, and to participate actively in governance. Yet they would also have lived in the shadow of dragons, understanding that ultimate power rested with a single individual whose will could reshape the world. This paradox would have created a generation of young people who were simultaneously more empowered and more anxious than their predecessors. They would have possessed unprecedented knowledge and opportunity, but they would also have carried the psychological burden of knowing that their entire world depended on the continued goodwill of an increasingly aging queen and her mortal dragon. As these young people reached adulthood, they would have faced a world that their education had prepared them to question and change, but that their political reality had taught them to fear disrupting. Some would have channeled their energy into working within the system, becoming passionate advocates for gradual reform and expansion of democratic institutions. Others would have become radical critics of the regime,
arguing that true freedom was impossible as long as dragons cast their shadow over the realm. The most dangerous consequence would have been the emergence of a generational conflict between those who remembered the old system and those who had only known the new. Older citizens, grateful for their liberation from feudal oppression, would have been inclined to support the status quo. Younger citizens, taking their freedoms for granted, would have demanded changes that their elders would have seen as dangerously ungrateful and destabilizing. The technological revolution, innovation in the shadow of magic, the reintroduction of magic into Westeros through the return of dragons, would have had unforeseen consequences for technological and scientific development throughout the realm. The coexistence of magical and mundane approaches to problem-solving would have created unique opportunities and challenges that would have fundamentally altered the trajectory of human knowledge and capability. The Maesters of the Citadel, long the guardians of scientific knowledge in Westeros, would have faced a crisis of purpose and methodology. Their empirical approach to understanding the world would have been challenged by the undeniable reality of dragon magic, forcing them to reconsider fundamental assumptions about causation, natural law, and the limits of human knowledge. Some Maesters would have embraced this challenge, attempting to study magical phenomena with the same rigor they applied to medicine, engineering, and astronomy. These investigations would have led to breakthrough discoveries about the nature of magic itself, potentially unlocking new applications that could benefit all of society. Imagine healing techniques that combined traditional medicine with magical enhancement, or engineering projects that utilized magical principles alongside conventional physics. However, the return of magic would also have stunted certain forms of technological development. Why invest in developing better siege engines when dragons could destroy any fortification? Why pursue advances in long-distance communication when magical means might be available? The very presence of magical solutions would have reduced incentives for mundane innovation in many areas. More troubling would have been the emergence of a magical technological divide within society. Those with access to magical knowledge and abilities would have possessed overwhelming advantages over those limited to conventional means. This could have created new forms of inequality even more profound than those based on birth or wealth, as magical ability might have been inherently limited to certain bloodlines or individuals. The unforeseen consequence would have been the development of a two-tiered civilization, a magical elite with access to powerful and wondrous capabilities, and a mundane majority relegated to increasingly obsolete conventional technology. This divide would have had political implications that could have ultimately undermined the egalitarian ideals that Daenerys had sought to establish.
One of the most overlooked, unforeseen consequences of Daenerys' victory would have been its environmental impact. Dragons, as apex predators with no natural enemies and enormous appetites, would have fundamentally disrupted Westeros' ecological balance in ways that would have had cascading effects throughout the natural world. Drogon's hunting patterns alone would have decimated local wildlife populations wherever the royal court traveled. Large herbivores, deer, elk, wild cattle, would have been preferred prey, leading to their rapid decline in regions where dragons hunted regularly. This would have had knock-on effects on predator populations, plant communities, and entire ecosystems that had evolved over millennia without draconic interference. The Queen's use of dragon fire as both weapon and tool would have had lasting environmental consequences. The destruction of King's Landing would have left the surrounding area contaminated with ash and debris that would have taken generations to fully remediate. More broadly, the use of dragon fire in warfare and construction would have released vast quantities of unusual compounds into the atmosphere, potentially affecting weather patterns and crop yields across the continent. Perhaps most significantly, the presence of dragons would have influenced human settlement and land use patterns in unprecedented ways. Areas where dragons roosted or hunted regularly would have become uninhabitable for normal wildlife and potentially dangerous for human community. This could have forced population migrations and agricultural adaptations that would have disrupted established communities and economic relationships. The long-term consequences might have included climate change, species extinctions, and fundamental alterations to Westeros' natural landscape. Ironically, The queen who had sought to liberate humanity from oppression might have inadvertently initiated an ecological catastrophe that would have oppressed future generations in ways that feudalism never could. Daenerys's efforts to create a unified, egalitarian Westeros would have had unforeseen consequences for the realm's rich cultural diversity. The very policies designed to break down barriers between different groups would have gradually eroded the distinct traditions, languages, and customs that had made each region unique. The standardization of education while democratizing access to knowledge would have promoted common languages, shared historical narratives, and uniform values that would have gradually displaced local tradition. Children educated in the new schools would have learned about their heritage as historical curiosities rather than living traditions, leading to a gradual cultural homogenization that would have impoverished the realm's intellectual and artistic life. The mobility enabled by improved transportation and communication networks would have accelerated this process. People would have moved more freely between regions, intermarrying and blending traditions in ways that would have created new cultural syntheses but would also have eliminated older, more distinct forms of cultural expression. Regional languages, dialects, and customs that had survived centuries of political unity would have begun to disappear under the pressure of standardized education and increased cultural exchange. The Iron Islands' unique maritime culture, Dorne's distinctive social practices, and the North's ancient traditions would have gradually been absorbed into a more homogeneous Westerosi identity. The unforeseen consequence would have been the creation of a realm that was more politically unified but culturally impoverished. Future generations would have inherited a world that was more equal and more prosperous, but also more uniform and less interesting than the one their ancestors had known. Daenerys's victory would have had unforeseen consequences that extended far beyond Westeros's borders, fundamentally altering the balance of power throughout the known world and creating new forms of international conflict and cooperation. The establishment of a powerful, ideologically revolutionary kingdom in Westeros would have posed an existential threat to established powers throughout The free cities, the Dothraki Khals, and other traditional elites would have recognized that Daenerys's ideas about equality, democracy, and human rights represented a direct challenge to their own authority and legitimacy. This would have led to the formation of anti-Westerosi coalitions dedicated to containing the spread of revolutionary ideas. These alliances would have been strange bedfellows indeed. Slaver cities cooperating with religious fundamentalists, merchant princes allying with nomadic warlords, all united by their fear of the changes that Daenerys represented. The result would have been a series of proxy wars, trade embargoes, and diplomatic crises that would have drawn Westeros into conflicts throughout the known world. The Queen's commitment to ending slavery would have required continuous military intervention in distant lands, draining resources that could have been used for domestic development and creating new opportunities for her enemies to strike back. More subtly, the success of Daenerys's reforms would have inspired revolutionary movements throughout Essos and beyond. Slaves, oppressed minorities, and political dissidents would have looked to Westeros as proof that radical change was possible, leading to uprisings and rebellions that would have destabilized entire regions. The unforeseen consequence would have been Westeros's transformation from an isolated kingdom into a revolutionary hegemon, committed to spreading its ideals throughout the world, but constantly threatened by the enemies that this mission would have created. Perhaps the most dangerous unforeseen consequence of Daenerys's victory would have been the constitutional crisis that would have inevitably emerged around the question of succession. The Queen's failure to produce an heir, combined with the revolutionary changes she had implemented, would have created a power vacuum that could have torn the realm apart. The various factions that had emerged during her reign, the Red Nobility, the religious movements, the regional interests, the generational divides, would have each promoted different solutions to the succession crisis. Some would have favored Jon Snow as the natural heir, others would have pushed for an elective system, and still others would have advocated for the complete abandonment of monarchy in favor of republican government. The absence of clear constitutional procedures for resolving such disputes would have meant that the succession would have been decided by force, negotiation, or some combination of the two. This process would have threatened to undo many of the gains that had been achieved during Daenerys's reign, as competing factions attempted to reshape the government according to their own vision.
The most tragic unforeseen consequence would have been that the very success of Daenerys's reforms would have made a peaceful transition of power more difficult, not easy. The various groups that had been empowered by her changes would have had too much to lose to accept a compromise solution, while those who had been disadvantaged would have seen the succession crisis as an opportunity to regain their former position. The result could have been a civil war, fought not between traditional noble houses, but between competing visions of what the post-feudal world should look like. This conflict would have been far more ideologically driven, and potentially more destructive than the wars that had preceded Daenerys's conquest.
The ultimate unforeseen consequence of Daenerys' victory would have been the gradual recognition that her entire revolutionary project depended on the life of a single mortal creature. As Drogon aged and showed signs of decline, the psychological and political effects on the realm would have been profound and potentially catastrophic. The knowledge that the dragons were not immortal would have created a pervasive anxiety throughout the kingdom. People who had built their lives around the security provided by draconic power would have faced the terrifying prospect of returning to a world where such protection was no longer available. This anxiety would have manifested in various forms of social pathology, increased religious fervor, political extremism, and nostalgic movements seeking to restore the old order. Efforts to preserve or replace draconic power would have consumed enormous resources and generated their own unforeseen consequences. Expeditions to find dragon eggs or discover the secrets of dragon breeding would have led to conflicts with other powers and potentially dangerous experiments with magical forces that were not fully understood. The approaching end of the Dragon Age would have forced difficult questions about the sustainability of the revolutionary changes that had been implemented. Which reforms could survive without the threat of dragonfire to enforce them? Which would collapse as soon as traditional power holders realized they no longer needed to fear draconic retribution? The most profound, unforeseen consequence would have been the gradual realization that the liberation of Westeros had been achieved not through the triumph of justice over oppression, but through the temporary dominance of one form of power over another. The dragons had broken the wheel, but they had also become the wheel, and their eventual death would have left the realm to confront the fundamental questions about power and justice that their presence had temporarily obscured. Beyond all the political, economic, and social consequences of Daenerys' hypothetical victory lies perhaps the most profound unforeseen effect: the psychological trauma that would have been embedded in the very fabric of Westerosi society. The speed and violence of the transformation, combined with the constant presence of dragons as symbols of ultimate power, would have created a collective psychological condition that would have influenced every aspect of life in the realm. The survivors of King's Landing's destruction would have carried their trauma not just as individuals but as a community. Their children and grandchildren would have inherited this trauma, creating a population that was simultaneously grateful for their improved circumstances and haunted by the knowledge of what their queen was capable of when opposed. This trauma would have manifested in various forms of collective behavior. Risk aversion would have become a dominant cultural trait, as people learned to avoid any action that might be interpreted as opposition to the crown. Innovation and entrepreneurship would have been stifled by the fear that success might be seen as a challenge to established authority. The constant presence of dragons would have created a form of learned helplessness that would have persisted even after they were gone. Generations of people would have grown up knowing that ultimate power lay beyond their reach or influence, creating a psychology of dependency and passivity that would have been difficult to overcome. Perhaps most tragically, the very success of Daenerys' reforms would have created a form of survivor's guilt that would have pervaded the entire society. People would have known that their improved lives had come at the cost of others' deaths, creating a pervasive sense of moral debt that would have influenced everything from personal relationships to artistic expression. The cultural and artistic unforeseen consequences of Daenerys' reign would have been particularly complex, creating both unprecedented opportunities for creative expression and subtle forms of censorship that would have shaped the realm's intellectual development for generations. The Queen's promotion of education and literacy would have created a vastly expanded audience for literature, poetry, and other forms of artistic expression. Former slaves and serfs who had never had access to written culture would have become consumers and eventually creators of new forms of art that reflected their unique experiences and perspective. However, the omnipresent awareness of draconic power would have created invisible boundaries around acceptable artistic expression.
Writers and artists would have learned to self-censor, avoiding themes or images that might be interpreted as criticism of the regime. This would have been particularly problematic, given the Queen's personal involvement in the destruction of King's Landing. Any artistic work that dealt with themes of power, violence, or moral ambiguity would have carried potential political implication. The result would have been a flowering of certain forms of artistic expression, particularly those celebrating liberation, transformation, and social justice, combined with the withering of other. Satirical literature, political commentary, and works that explored the darker aspects of human nature would have gradually disappeared, not through official censorship, but through the artist's own recognition of the dangers inherent in such expression. Future generations would have inherited a cultural legacy that was simultaneously richer and more constrained than what had come before. They would have had access to more diverse voices and perspectives, but those voices would have been speaking within parameters defined by the revolutionary trauma that had created their world. One of the most subtle but potentially devastating unforeseen consequences of Daenerys' victory would have been its effect on scientific and technological progress. The return of magic to Westeros would have fundamentally altered the incentive structures that drive human innovation, potentially leading to centuries of intellectual stagnation. The presence of dragons would have made certain forms of technological development seem unnecessary or even pointless. Why develop better metallurgy when dragon fire could melt any metal? Why pursue advances in engineering when magical solutions might be available? The very existence of magical alternatives would have reduced the urgency that drives scientific inquiry. More problematically, the integration of magical and mundane approaches to problem solving would have created a situation where scientific method itself became suspect. If dragons could achieve results that seemed to violate natural law, then perhaps natural law itself was unreliable. This could have led to a gradual abandonment of empirical investigation in favor of magical thinking. The maesters of the Citadel, traditionally the guardians of scientific knowledge, would have faced an impossible choice: embrace magical studies and abandon their commitment to empirical investigation, or maintain their scientific approach and risk becoming irrelevant in a world where magic provided superior solutions to practical problems. The unforeseen consequence would have been the emergence of a civilization that was more powerful in the short term, but less innovative in the long term. Future generations would have inherited magical capabilities that they didn't fully understand and couldn't improve upon, making them dependent on forces beyond their control and potentially vulnerable to catastrophic failure if those forces ever fail.
Perhaps the most insidious unforeseen consequence of Daenerys' victory would have been its effect on moral reasoning throughout Westerosi society. The Queen's use of dragonfire to destroy King's Landing would have established a precedent that extreme violence could be justified if it served sufficiently noble ends, creating a form of moral relativism that would have corrupted ethical thinking for generations. Citizens of the new order would have been taught that the destruction of the capital was regrettable but necessary, that the deaths of innocents were tragic but justified by the greater good that resulted. This reasoning would have become embedded in the culture, creating a population that was predisposed to accept violence and oppression as long as they could be framed in terms of noble intention. This moral flexibility would have had practical consequences in areas ranging from criminal justice to international relations. Officials would have been more willing to use harsh methods against perceived enemies of the state, justifying their actions by reference to the greater good. Citizens would have been more accepting of government overreach, having been conditioned to believe that temporary injustices were acceptable if they served long-term benefits. The effect on individual psychology would have been equally profound. People would have learned to rationalize their own moral compromises by reference to the greater good, creating a society of individuals who were simultaneously more idealistic and more capable of self-deception than their predecessor. Future generations would have inherited a moral framework that was both more sophisticated and more dangerous than traditional ethical system. They would have been capable of justifying almost any action in terms of noble intentions, making them potentially more dangerous than those who openly embraced selfish motivation. The central contradiction of Daenerys' hypothetical reign, the establishment of democratic institutions through authoritarian means, would have created unforeseen consequences that would have undermined the very ideals she sought to promote. The democratic institutions she established would have been forever tainted by their violent origins, creating a form of government that was simultaneously more participatory and more fragile than traditional monarchies. Citizens educated in democratic ideals, but living under the ultimate authority of dragons would have developed a complex relationship with concepts like consent, representation, and popular sovereignty. They would have understood these ideas intellectually but would have had limited opportunity to practice them meaningfully, creating a population that was theoretically prepared for democracy but practically unprepared for its responsibility. The democratic institutions themselves would have operated within parameters defined by the crown's ultimate authority. Local councils could debate and decide minor issues, but everyone would have understood that major decisions remained subject to royal approval. This would have created a form of pseudo-democracy that might have been more frustrating and ultimately more destabilizing than honest autocracy. When the dragons finally died and these constraints were removed, the resulting political system would have faced a crisis of legitimacy. Having been established through force rather than consent, democratic institutions would have lacked the moral authority necessary to maintain order during difficult periods. The result could have been political chaos as various factions attempted to fill the power vacuum left by the dragon's demise. In examining the unforeseen consequences of Daenerys Targaryen's hypothetical victory, we confront a sobering truth about the nature of revolutionary change. Good intentions are no guarantee of good outcomes, and even the most noble ideals can produce unintended effects that corrupt or destroy the very values they were meant to protect. The Dragon Queen's victory would have created a world that was simultaneously better and worse than what came before. More equal but less free. More prosperous but less stable. More unified but less diverse. The children of her revolution would have inherited opportunities their ancestors could never have imagined, but they would also have carried burdens that previous generations had never known. Perhaps most troubling of all, these unforeseen consequences would have been largely invisible to those living through them. The psychological, cultural, and moral changes would have happened gradually, each generation accepting as normal what the previous generation would have found shocking. The revolution would have devoured its own ideals so slowly and subtly that few would have noticed until it was too late to reverse course. The ultimate unforeseen consequence might have been the realization that breaking the wheel had not eliminated oppression, but had simply created new forms of it. Forms that were potentially more dangerous because they were disguised as liberation. The dragons that had seemed like instruments of justice would have revealed themselves to be chains of a different sort, binding the realm to a form of freedom that was indistinguishable from servitude. In the end, Daenerys' victory would have posed questions that her defeat avoided. Is it possible to create a just society through unjust means? Can democratic values survive their violent birth? And what price are we willing to pay for the promise of a better world? These questions would have haunted Westeros long after the dragons were gone, serving as a reminder that the most dangerous tyrannies are often those that begin with the best intention. The realm that emerged from the Dragon Queen's reign would have been a monument to both human aspiration and human folly, a testament to our capacity for both creation and destruction, liberation and oppression, hope and despair. As we contemplate this alternative history, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about power, justice, and the price of change. The shadow cast by dragons is long indeed, but perhaps the longest shadow is the one cast by our own good intentions when they are pursued without wisdom, restraint, or humility. In the end, the most profound unforeseen consequence of Daenerys' victory might have been the lesson it taught about the nature of power itself, that even the most benevolent tyranny is still tyranny, and that the road to hell remains paved with good intentions, no matter how sincere or noble they might be.